Okay, so for this class, we want to now start talking about the Constitution and really go a little more in depth, talking about the different political institutions that make up the United States. After spending one class talking about political theory and how we can understand American politics in the present day, maybe extending this theory backwards into the past as well. Last class talking about political culture and the shared values and beliefs that are conducive to democracy, that complement democracy, basically. Now we're going to get into that a little bit more as far as, talking about the actual institutions. I did want to, and I think, mention this already, talk a little bit, though, about capitalism and how that fits in here. I would argue that capitalism is as important to the founding of the United States as anything else, as any of these important founding documents. The reason for that is that from its very beginning, the United States was a capitalist economy. And you could make a very good argument, and people have already, that the economic interests of the founders played a very big role in shaping how the Constitution turned out to be, and shaping the direction of the institutions of the American government. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, obviously, the most important critic of capitalism, one of the most important people to ever try to theorize about how a capitalist system works, is Marx. I'm going to run through this very quickly. I'll suggest a few books to read if you want to read up more on this. I do want to keep these lectures somewhat short, and I want to get to the matter at hand, of course. But like I said, I think this is a very sort of important foundational thing. Quite frankly, most classes or most discussions on American politics and the Constitution are probably going to neglect this. So I think at the very least, it's important to have sort of an alternative point of view here. First of all, here are a few important quotes from Marx about history. He writes, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Very suitable quote for talking about what we are engaged with for today's discussion. The generations of the past, the traditions of the past do very much weigh upon us now. We are, for better or for worse, more or less stuck with the system of government that we have. It's very hard to imagine really making any significant changes in how the political system operates. So again, like I said, for better or for worse, we are pretty much stuck with this. Also, his phrasing of how people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please, I think is a very important idea as well. We are not fully in control of the direction of history. Even very powerful people, even the capitalist class. There are things that happen which go against even what they want. And of course, that's a very important part of how Marx understands capitalism, because Marx basically argues that capitalism sets into play forces which nobody can control and which often lead to very, negative outcomes. He goes on to say, you could say more about this, but like I said, I'm going to try to run through it pretty fast. He says, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. So this interplay between what he calls relations of production and forces of production are, again, very important. What he's saying is that what is often referred to as the economic base of society is sort of formed by these things. You have forces of production, technology, the actual things that we use to produce things, whether it's crops on a farm, goods being produced out of a factory, things like that. And then out of that comes relations of production, basically social relationships between people that are sort of governed by how we produce things. So in a society where agriculture is the predominant form of economic activity, there are going to be certain types of social relationships between people that correspond to that. There are going to be certain types of social relationships between people that correspond to an industrial society as well. And of course, you have various sort of intermediate aspects to that as well. The United States is not a society that's purely agricultural or purely industrial, but to the extent that you find different parts of society that are like that, you, generally speaking, social relations between people correspond to that. Of course, in the United States history, you have a very strong, especially back in these days, or leading up to the Civil War, a very strong geographical division between the North and South. The North was the industrial part of the country. The South was the agricultural part of the country, for the most part. You know, you had obviously agriculture in the North as well. You had some industry within the South, but very limited for the most part. And corresponding to that, you had different, a different set of social relationships that developed out of that. Of course, in the South, as we all know, slavery corresponded to that. The plantation economies, not even small scale agriculture, but large scale agriculture that employed large workforces and did very sort of grueling, labor intensive labor. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, what he refers to as the superstructure of society basically refers to politics, and as well as other things, religion, culture, various things like that. But for our interest here, we're mostly concerned with politics. So what he's saying is that the political structure or superstructure sort of forms on top of the economic structure or the economic base. So again, the political organization of life, the political organization of power is also going to correspond to the economic structure of society. And again, just like I said, the economic structure of the United States is going to significantly determine how that political structure takes place. Now, at this point, maybe it's a good time to bring up the fact that people often, accuse Marx of reducing everything to the economy. They refer to him as an economic determinist, meaning that everything is determined by the economy. That's not actually true. Many people have written upon this. One important person is the professor of politics at NYU, Bertil Ohlman, who talks about the importance of abstraction in Marxist thinking. And what he means by that is that basically what Marx is doing is he's abstracting from reality. He's literally pulling out an aspect of reality, analyzing it, investigating it, trying to understand it, how it works for our benefit, basically. He's not saying that that's all of reality. He's not saying that capitalism is all of reality. But if you want to pick up one specific aspect of reality that we call capitalism and isolate it and analyze it and try to understand it, this is pretty much how it works. So this is an important argument, I think, to make in order to defend against the criticism that Marx reduces everything to the economy. He doesn't actually, he doesn't realize, or he realizes that in real life, not everything can be reduced to economic forces in this way. But again, to the extent that you want to understand how capitalism works as a portion of reality, albeit an extremely important part of reality, and I think that should be fairly obvious that capitalism is a very important part of it, that is how you would try to approach it and to understand it. Anyway, the third quote pretty much speaks to the same thing again. Again, Marx says the mode of production of material life. So Marx never really refers to capitalism per se. He refers to the capitalist mode of production. And again, a mode of production refers to the things I just talked about, the forces of production, the relations of production, kind of as they sort of correspond to each other, they make up a mode of production, whether it's capitalism, whether it's feudalism, and so forth. Anyway, so the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being or existence, basically, But on the contrary, they're social being that determines their consciousness. And this is a very sort of philosophical idea. Marx is in many ways referring to or responding to sort of the dominant philosophical currents in his day, which is usually referred to as idealism. The idea that ideas have their sort of own independent existence, and that they kind of shape the world around us. Marx is basically saying that no, actually, it's our social life that determines our philosophical views, our cultural views, our political views, and everything else. So that's important to understand. And again, I would argue that this plays a very important role in understanding the Constitution as well. I would argue that the framers were very much influenced by their economic interests, that the political form of government that took shape under the Constitution was very much influenced by the economic forces that existed in society at that time, and still do. So real quick, if I can just kind of run through very quickly what Marx means by capitalism. Keep in mind that this is, I'm summarizing like a 3-volume work known as Capital, which is very long. Each volume, in fact, is very long. Only the first volume was actually published in Marx's lifetime. The other 2 volumes were sort of published posthumously out of notes that he had left behind. But anyway, capitalism, I guess in its simplest terms, is a system of producing commodities for sale on the market in order to raise a profit. That should be added to that as well. So capitalism is a way of producing commodities for sale on the market. Commodities, market, and profit are sort of the key points here. Now, a commodity is a very specific thing. It is not something that's produced for use, for self-subsistence purposes. It's not a gift that you give to somebody. A commodity is something that is produced purely for exchange. You're making something so you can sell it and make money off of it. And really, it could be almost anything. It could be, an agricultural product. It can be an industrial product. It can be knowledge. It can be drugs. It could be narcotics. It can be a house. It can be oil. It can be anything that you can basically sell and make money off of could basically be a commodity, including human beings, something obviously that in American context we would have to understand as well. The actual usefulness, the actual use or purpose of the thing is kind of beside the point. It doesn't really matter as long as you can sell it. Now, you would assume that only things that had a use for people would be sold, and to a large extent that is true. But look at where our economy is going now. Look at all the crazy shit that people make money off of selling now that have no purpose to them. Think of things like NFTs, if you want to take an extreme example of that. And there are various other things. Again, going back to fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have a definite use and utility to them. But look at all the negative consequences that come along with that. Yet we can't stop ourselves, or, speaking for society as a whole, we can't stop ourselves from consuming these things and producing these things because they're extremely profitable. So keep that in mind. Now, commodities are produced by workers who sell their labor power in return for wages, their ability to work, their ability to exercise energy and power over something to create something or to fashion it in a certain way. And according to Marx, the value of a commodity is determined both by the costs of the materials that go into it, but also by the average amount of labor that goes into it, or was often referred to as the socially necessary amount of labor that goes into it. What you would sort of need to, the amount of labor the sort of minimum amount of labor that you would need to expend to produce something under average conditions, meaning the person's more or less working to the full extent of their ability, not slacking off or goofing off or something like that. Workers create value through their labor. Through labor, you transform raw materials into more valuable finished products. Labor is the only thing that creates new value. The raw materials, the things that you use in the process of making something, transfer their value. Whatever value they have sort of stored up in them gets transferred into the new product. but it doesn't create any new value. Only the labor expended by the worker creates new value. And this is generally called the labor theory of value. Now, value can be measured in terms of labor hours or price, and meaning the amount of hours that you spend on working on something, or sort of the monetary expression of this, the sort of monetary form of value, which is, in American context would be in terms of dollars. So so value can be measured in the amount of hours it takes to make something, or it can be measured in its value in money, basically. Increased productivity does not increase value. So as you increase your output, as you produce more stuff in the same amount of time, it does not actually increase the value of things. Value is spread out or sort of extended among different products. So if you're a worker and you're producing a certain number of products, and then something happens and you double that amount, you double your output, those goods don't have the same amount of value attached to them. It's the same amount of value that the worker produces over the course of an hour, let's say, but now more of that value is sort of contained or spread out within these different products. In more conventional terms, this is what causes the prices of things to go down. And normally, as we increase productivity, as we produce more stuff, the prices of things go down, they become cheaper. And that would be because, again, that value is being spread out more and more. Now, most people take value for granted. They just assume the things have a value. What Marx is saying, though, is that value is a very sort of coercive thing. That we live in a society which people are essentially compelled to produce value, and the necessities of producing value imposes severe consequences upon society at large. So in many ways, what Marx wants to do is just sort of liberate people from producing value. He doesn't want people to stop producing things. He wants people to produce things that are useful, but not necessarily value in the sense in which he is talking about it here. Things that don't necessarily have a monetary value for them, but things which we could still use. Now, the way in which capital works, sometimes referred to as the circuit of capital. Capitalists advance sums of money or capital to invest in production, including wages paid to workers. So they lay out a certain amount of money. They use part of that money to buy machines, raw materials, things like that. They also use some of that money to hire workers to work on these things and to produce things. And sort of the sort of magic of capitalism, I didn't include this here, and I should have, is that it's usually expressed by the formula M C P M prime, meaning you start off with a certain amount of money, you produce to buy commodities, you produce more commodities with it, and you end up at the end of it with more money than what you start with. It's almost like a magical sort of property of capital. You start off with a certain amount of money, you expend that money in production, and at the end of the cycle, you end up with more money than what you started with. That is essentially how it works, of course, in a simplified version. But how do you end up with more money? Well, according to Marx, workers, the wages that workers receive are less than the value they create through their labor. Essentially, a portion of the working day is unpaid labor. Workers spend a portion of the day basically working for free, except they're not aware of that, right? And of course, they're constantly being told that the wages that they receive is equal to the value of their labor or equal to their productivity. But Marx would say that it is not. And of course, what that introduces is that there is a fundamental injustice within the capitalist system. Workers are not receiving a fair return on their labor. They're in fact creating more than what they're actually getting back in return. Now, Marx tends to not like to use terms like justice and things like that because he generally regards them as sort of bourgeois concepts for the most part. And you could argue about that, and people debate about it and have written things on it. I guess I would argue, for simplicity's sake, that there is at least a sort of implicit notion of justice within what Marx is talking about, even if he doesn't actually like to use that term. He does at other places, refer to capitalists as robbing the workers. So if you're robbing somebody, isn't that, an injustice? Aren't you sort of violating, a sort of basic ethical principle here? But that, of course, is a very sort of important part of that. So they perform this unpaid labor is essentially called surplus labor, extra labor. And what it does is it produces surplus value, produces extra value. So even though the capitalist has to spend money paying workers and buying materials and things like that, the reason why he's able to end up with more money at the end of this is because the worker has produced surplus value for him, and the capitalist keeps it. And this is sort of a simplified way of looking at it. But again, if you want to sort of run through a simple example of this, this is according to Andrew Kleiman, who's an important Marxist economist. He gives this example. He says each hour of labor, try to imagine then a situation where each hour of labor produces $60 in value. So every hour that you work, you're producing $60 worth of value. A worker receives $600 a week in wages. So it only takes the first 10 hours of the week to equal that $600. If you're producing $60 of value, it only takes 10 hours to equal $600 worth of value. But you don't just stop working after 10 hours, you work an additional 30 hours. So 30 times 60 equals $1,800 worth of surplus value. Now, $2,400 worth of total value, right? Because the total value of what the worker creates, $60 an hour, times 40 gives you $2,400 worth of value. The capitalist doesn't keep all that, though, right? The capitalist has to then pay out $600. So that cuts into their profit, essentially, to the worker. It doesn't include it here, but then you would also then reduce that further based on, the costs of materials and things like that. So the profit that the capitalist takes at the end of this is the surplus value is value minus what they pay out to workers and minus the costs of materials. That basically makes up their surplus value. This is where profits come from. Profits basically come from surplus value. Now things get a little more complicated from here. It's not simply just a question that each individual capitalist is exploiting each individual worker. The sort of distribution of surplus value happens in a kind of macro sense. It happens at the level of the economy as a whole. And it's only when you have a certain process of production, the total amount of surplus value that's produced, not just in one industry or one company, but in the total amount of society, it's how that surplus value is allocated where this thing actually happens. So it's much more of a complex thing. I don't think there's any real good way I can explain that better in a short amount of time. But it's important to keep in mind this is a very sort of macro level thing. It can't simply be observed at the individual level or at the level of even one company. It's something that kind of works out at society, at the level of society as a whole, or in the world of globalization, perhaps at the level of the global economy. And I think that's part of the reason why this fundamental exploitation, and that is the word that Marx uses for it, he doesn't like to refer to as injustice, he refers to as exploitation of labor. That's why it's so hard to see, because it's not such a one-to-one thing. It's not so directly observable from one capitalist to one worker, or from one capitalist even to their entire workforce. It's something that you can only really sort of discern the mechanics of how this works at the level of society as a whole. So you basically have to study the economy as a whole to really understand how this works. Beyond that, capital goes through this process of circulation. And as it goes through circulation, it takes on different forms. It takes on the form of profit, but also takes on the form of rent. Part of that capital which becomes profit. Part of that then is even then paid out. Let's say if the capitalist is leasing land from a landlord. So you pay the landlord some of that. Some of it is paid out in interest to bankers, assuming that the capitalist takes out loans to finance their business. So the banker gets a share of that, which also means that the landlord and the banker also has an interest in seeing the exploitation of labor. They may not do that directly, but they indirectly benefit. And part of that also, of course, takes the form of taxes as well, which is paid out to the government. So because it happens at this sort of big macro level, and because it sort of circulates and takes on all these different forms, it becomes very hard to see this exploitation taking place. It's very hard to see. I mean, it goes on all the time, arguably, if you accept this theory, of course, but it's very difficult to observe that. Unless, of course, you engage with this kind of material. Now, there's a lot of talk about value, and there's a lot of talk about price. Again, this is something else I'm just going to have to run through very, very quickly. But one of the most important relationships is trying to understand the difference between the value of something and the price of something. Many people would argue that they have caught Marx in a contradiction when they can demonstrate that the price of something, the price of a commodity, does not equal its value. They say, well, look, we've got you, Marx. Now, Marx seems to have anticipated that kind of criticism, and he has his way of sort of explaining why values and prices do diverge often. But again, it's another complicated thing to understand. Now, his sort of proof of it, though, the proof of what is called the labor theory of value, Marx would say, again, when you look at the macro level of society as a whole, he would say that you see an equality between certain things, between certain key relationships. If you look at the total value of output and the total price of output, the total price value of things, they are equal. But again, you can only observe this at the level of society as a whole, not at individual companies or even different industries within the economy, but only at the level of the economy as a whole. He also argues that the total surplus value produced in the economy is equal to the total amount of profits produced within the economy. Those things holding true, if those things actually equalize or equal out to each other, Marx would argue gives you a kind of proof that what he's talking about, the labor theory of value, is true, that this is where surplus value comes from. This is how surplus value is extracted. And this is basically the source of profits in a capitalist economy. Now, that's my sort of very breezy way of sketching through it. Further reading, if you would like to read more about this, obviously you have Marx's 3 volumes of Capital. More contemporary readings, I tend to go back to the book Reclaiming Marx's Capital by Andrew Kleinman, as well as a book by Fred Mosley entitled Money and Totality. These are, I think, very good books to read to give you a kind of a more condensed version of Marx's theory, at least more condensed than in his his 3 volumes of Capital. Now, I'll say just a few more things about it, which is that you also have to talk about the rate of profit in society. So what the rate of profit is basically a percentage, 20%, 30%, 15%. It's the rate in which profit is accruing to the companies, the industries, the economy as a whole. Now, Marx argues that the profit rates, the percentage of profit basically that you're making over a given period of time, tends to equalize. So companies tend to earn an equal amount of profit. And the way in which that's another complicated thing, is explaining how that actually happens. But he argues that there's a tendency, doesn't mean it always happens, but there's a tendency for these things to equalize, because as more capital flows into more highly profitable businesses, it actually lowers the rate of profit. So capital is always in search of the highest rate of profit. Whatever it can make the greatest amount of profit, it's going to go to. The flip side of that, the other side of that, is that as more capital flows into an industry, it actually lowers the rate of profit. Now, this is something that has been talked about, by the way, by other economists besides Marx. In fact, the labor theory of value was not invented by Marx either. It was invented by liberal economists prior to Marx. And, again, there's a whole complicated history to that, which I really won't go into right now. Just to mention that in passing. Anyway, what this happens, it creates an average rate of profit for businesses. So businesses are profiting at a certain rate. They're profiting at a 20% rate, meaning whatever capital that they invested, they get a 20% return on it, or 15%, and so on and so forth. Now, he says the goods usually sell at their market price, not at their value. Market price. So this is, again, how Marx kind of gets around this idea that value and price for individual commodities don't always equal. At the macro level, they do, but at the individual level, they don't. Market prices fluctuate around what he calls prices of production. And what the prices of production are basically the cost of producing something, that is the cost of the materials and labor, plus the average rate of profit. So the profit that a capitalist actually gets is not corresponding to the value of things, but it corresponds more to the price of production or to the market price, which is, again, how much it costs to produce something plus the average rate of profit, which tends to, again, equal out for society as a whole. Goods do not sell at their value under most circumstances, but, again, fluctuate around the prices of production. So simply to show that goods do not sell at value is not disproving Marx. That's an important thing, again, because, like I said, a lot of people claim that they've been able to disprove Marx by showing that, but Marx would argue, and other economists like Kleiman and Mosley would argue that does not disprove Marx. The Marx is fully aware of the fact that individual commodities, individual goods, their price will not correspond to their value, but at the macro level, he would argue that they do. Now, when Marx is talking, again, when he's talking about the rate of profit, he's talking about the whole economy, not just companies or industries. Now, there's another thing that happens, which is that where companies that employ more labor tend to produce more profit, but they don't actually always get to keep that profit for themselves. Again, labor theory of value, Marx says that labor is what creates more value. So a company that employs more workers is going to create more surplus value than a company that uses more capital. It uses more capital on machines and things like that. Those machines are not creating new value. They're transferring their value, whatever it costs to produce those machines, they're transferring a part of that into the goods that they are creating, but they're not creating any new value. Now, so what happens then is that there's a sort of a transference of value that goes on. Companies that employ a lot of labor create more surplus value, but they essentially lose some of that surplus value to companies that use more capital. And this happens as the profit rate tends to equalize. So what happens is that countries that companies, rather, you could talk about this with countries as well in terms of globalization, but companies that have a higher rate of profit lose some of that profit essentially as the profit rate equalizes, whereas companies that have a lower rate of profit gain some of that profit. Think of it as, if you want to use a simple example, think of, one company that has a 60% rate of profit, which would be very high, and then another company that has a 20% rate of profit, right? The sort of average between those two would be 40%. So the company that has a 60% rate of profit is actually losing, right? Because they're producing 60% profits on what they're producing, but they only get to keep 40% of it. Whereas the company that is producing 20% also gets to keep 40% of it. So they're actually gaining. Again, complicated thing. All I can do is really just kind of sketch out a little bit of how this works. Now, again, Marx argued that there is a contradiction between increased profits and increased productivity. As the economy becomes more and more productive, it tends to lower the profit rate, right? So here's a quote from Kleiman here. He says, Marx held that as capitalist production develops, capitalists tend to adopt more productive labor-saving technologies. That is, they turn increasingly to methods of production that replace workers with machines. So again, that would also be what people refer to as capital intensive. Machines usually cost a lot of money. So you're replacing workers with machines, you're increasing productivity, you're producing more stuff, but you're getting less profit because you're laying off those workers, the workers who, through their surplus value is what is creating profit for you. So again, as you lay off more workers, less workers equals less surplus equals less profit. Machines are not paid a wage, so they do not create surplus value. Even if you raise the productivity of labor, it does not increase profits. The same amount of value spread out among more products, again, lower prices. Now, there is another sort of short-term way in which this works, which I'm mostly skipping over, but Marx does argue that as productivity increases, it also for a time increases the so-called rate of surplus value, which is another complicated relationship. I'm going to mostly skip over that because it's another complicated idea to explain. But suffice to say, whatever gains you get from raising the rate of surplus value, basically getting more surplus out of workers doing the same amount of work, is only a short-term fix, basically. It's not going to last for long. So what the tendency is over time is for the rate of profit to fall. So if you're making 20%, if the rate of profit in the economy, again, as a whole, is 20%, then next year it's going to be 15%, then the year after that's going to be 10%, and so on and so forth. Now, as this rate of profit falls, it leads to a fall in capital accumulation, right? So companies now who are getting this average rate of profit are seeing that average rate of profit go down. And as their rate of profit is going down, they're getting less capital. They're getting less profit. It doesn't even necessarily have to fall in an absolute sense, right? If you're getting a 20% return on your investment one year, and then that return is 10% next year, in absolute terms, you're still making money, but you can't help but notice that the profit that you're getting is now like half of what you're getting the year before. So that's pretty bad. And what that does is it causes businesses to slow down. They stop hiring workers. They don't produce as much stuff. Maybe initially they even try to produce more, thinking that they're going to make more of a profit, but then that doesn't happen. So then they start to slow things down. So what Marx is basically saying is that as the rate of profit falls, it leads to a crisis and then a depression, something which we should all be familiar with living in this economy. So Marx considered what is known as the LTFRP, the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, or sometimes the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which would be, I guess, LTRPF. Kleiman uses this formulation, though, LTFRP. He considers this to be the most important law of political economy. He considers this to be his own sort of unique, original contribution to understanding how capitalism works. Whereas almost everything else that I've been talking about up until now was an idea that Marx either borrowed from or adapted from previous economists before him. The profit rate tends to fall in a capitalist system, leading to crises. There are ways to stop the profit rate from falling, but there are only short-term solutions. You can raise the rate of surplus value. You can try to squeeze the workers more, make them work longer hours. You can find other ways to cut costs, various things like that. You can lobby the government for tax cuts as a way to raise your profit rate. The point, though, is that there are things that you can do, but they tend to only be short-term solutions. Marx referred to these as counteracting influences. He says that they are at work checking and canceling the effect of the general law, and that the LTFRP has constantly to be overcome by way of crises. So the way in which the process sort of resets itself is that the rate of profit falls too low, you have a crisis. It sort of resets the process of capital accumulation, but at great cost, obviously, to people. Unemployment, bankruptcies, all sorts of negative consequences stemming from that. So you have to go through all that just to basically get the rate of profit to sort of start up again. So essentially, the reason why Marx wanted to get rid of capitalism, I mean, he doesn't say this explicitly, but we could sort of look at it like this. You kind of only have two choices. You're sort of, as it says, stuck between a rock and a hard place. You let the profit rate fall, you get a crisis. Like I said, this leads to mass unemployment, people can't pay their bills, etc. Or the only way in which you can stop that from happening is to basically squeeze the workers more, make them work harder, cut their wages, do various ways to try to get more and more profit out of the workers, or other things. Again, cut taxes, go to different countries and exploit cheaper labor there, as we've seen over the last several decades here. You do all that, but even that only kind of delays the inevitable. Eventually, that tendency is going to assert itself. And that's basically why Marx wanted a revolution, to abolish the capitalist system. He was firmly against the idea that you can reform it, that you can sort of, do little things here and there, like raise the minimum wage and things like that. None of that stuff is going to work, he thought. Now, the only other thing I'll say about this, because I think I'm sort of moving on from here. I said a rock and a hard place. This is the myth of Sisyphus from Greek mythology. The guy had to push a boulder up to the top of the hill, and as soon or to the top of the mountain, and as soon as he gets to the top, the boulder falls down again. That's almost like understanding what capitalism is. You have to go through these great exertions to raise the rate of profit. The boulder is basically the rate of profit. Raise that profit rate through great exertions, through great human toil and suffering. But no matter what, that boulder is eventually going to come down the hill anyway, come down the mountain anyway. Now, there are Marxists. Obviously, mainstream economists reject this theory, but who really cares what they think? They're pretty clueless for the most part. I'm kidding, of course, but I mean they have several problems. I think not being able to foresee the economic crash in 2008, not really being able to come up with any effective solutions for the profound economic malaise that the people are finding themselves in now. Many Marxist economists, though, actually don't accept that theory as far as the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. They would argue that things like monopolies or oligopolies, where you have a handful of companies that control an industry and things like that, they argue that is kind of canceled out the law of the tendency or the tendential fall in the rate of profit. Now, you can debate those things. I mean, I'm not really going to do that here. I would argue that some Marxists that sort of adhere closer to Marx's original theory have seemed to provide at least some kind of empirical evidence to suggest this. So this is from another economist named Michael Roberts, who shows basically preceding every major slump you've had since the 1950s, there's been a massive fall in the rate of investment. As the rate of profit falls, capitalists invest less in their businesses, and as that falls, then it basically leads up to a crisis. Eventually, it falls so low that it can't, continue to finance production, and you start, laying people off and stuff. So, again, I mean, you can certainly argue with how he gets to these numbers, but he shows you, if you accept what he's saying, it seems like a pretty clear relationship here. You see a massive fall in investment prior to every major recession that we've had in recent history. Of course, you see a massive fall in investment leading up to the crash of 2008. So that would at least be some kind of empirical evidence for what he's talking about. This is a measurement of the falling rate of profit according to Kleiman. So that's, this is Marx's theory. I mean, what I've been talking about up until now is Marx's theory. What is the empirical evidence to support that theory? Is there actually a tendency for the rate of profit to fall? Again, Marx allows for the possibility that there are things which can kind of cancel it out or check it for a certain amount of time. So when all is said and done, is the rate of profit actually falling? Well, according to Kleiman and according to other Marxist economists, yes, it is. As you can see, this red line shows you quite clearly that the rate of profit has fallen from a high of about, maybe 43% or something like that in the early 1950s to almost half of that amount by the time you get up to 2015. Here's another chart from Michael Roberts, which is a little more recent and a little more clear, maybe, perhaps. Now all right. So another thing is that there's many different ways in which you can measure the rate of profit. several different ways. In fact, Kleiman has his way, Roberts has his way. In fact, he's even showing you two different ways in which you can measure it, which are similar, but you can see some differences. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time, analyzing all the differences between the two. What they do have in common, though, of course, is that whatever the differences may be, there is an overall tendency for the rate of profit to fall, as you can see. Here's something else. Now, those usually look at the whole economy. This is a rate of profit in the non-financial corporations, which is generally considered to be the more productive part of the economy. You would want it to include basically industry and manufacturing. There are some other things included within that as well. The reason why he excludes finance is because he argues that, again, finance doesn't really create any new value. Finance takes a cut of value that's produced in industry as it gets sort of, circulated around. So he would argue that by looking only at the rate of profit in non-financial corporations gives you a better sense of the health of the economy. And I would, based on my understanding of things, would take this to maybe be the more accurate reading of the so-called health of the economy. And again, you can see that, again, starting from a relatively high point in the 1940s and 50s, the rate of profit starts to fall precipitously in the 1960s, reaching a low point in the early 1980s, where it begins to rise again. One of the big differences between Kleiman and Roberts here, Kleiman does not see much of an improvement in the rate. In fact, he doesn't see any improvement in the rate of profit in the 1980s. It continues to fall for the most part. Roberts argues that there is a little bit of an improvement in the 1980s as, again, government cuts taxes, as unions are crushed within this country, as things begin to be outsourced. And basically, like I said, just, squeezing more profits out of workers. There is a little bit of a recovery in the profit rate, but that basically peaks in 1997, kind of a long time ago at this point. And then basically since then, it's just been falling, leading to what he calls the long depression. In his view of things, which I would also tend to agree with, the economy essentially never really recovered from the 2008 crash, even though what he refers to as the long depression kind of preceded that even. As you can see, in 2008, the profit rate falls even more. It improves a little bit, but then it begins to plummet again to where we are now. So what this would suggest then, again, if you accept what they're talking about here, is that capitalism is in long-term decline. Starting from World War II, which was in many ways kind of a great reset, you can say that the system has begun to fall apart and has been falling apart for quite a long time. Now, that goes a long way, I think, to explaining a lot of the other issues I talked about in previous classes. Income inequality, stagnant wages, massive debts that people, households, and also businesses are carrying around. Because again, if there's less profits being produced, then businesses are going to take on more and more debt. All those things, I think, in many ways speak to this idea. And I think there's good reason to suggest, or there's good reason to accept that what they're saying, I think, is a fairly accurate diagnosis of what's going on here. Now, as this relates to the Constitution, this is my long preamble to getting to talk about this. As I've already said, the economic interests of the founders very much shaped the way the Constitution was. And they were capitalists. They weren't necessarily industrial capitalists. But capitalism doesn't necessarily have to depend on industry either. In fact, Marx would argue that prior to the Industrial Revolution, that you have commercial agriculture, for example. You have trading. You have what he calls, merchant capital. That these are the things that sort of precede the development of industrial capital. And you do have that within the United States. And you have, even early factories there. Ironically enough, the Declaration of Independence is written in the same year that the book The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith is published. Adam Smith is sort of like the patron saint of capitalism. I mean, his ideas, well, actually, in some ways, his ideas are not very followed well, because he actually had some very interesting things to say about bankers and financial interests. and monopolies and things like that. But he's generally taken to be the sort of arch defender of the capitalist system. And so he's writing at a time where, you know, capitalism's already on the way. Again, you already see the earliest stirrings of the Industrial Revolution, even by the latter point of the 18th century, by the latter point of the 1700s. So the Constitution, the United States, is formed basically almost around the same time in which capitalism is forming, and capitalism is becoming sort of the dominant economic system. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think there's good reason to think that the economic interest of the founders basically shaped what the Constitution was. And you could argue that essentially a big part of what the Constitution is, and our political system as a whole, again, what Marx would call the superstructure, is to basically preserve and protect the capitalist system, to keep capitalism running. And it does that by various ways. First of all, it's not a very democratic constitution, as we all know. And if you don't, hopefully after this class, you will know. The Constitution is set up in a way to significantly inhibit and undermine the power of a democratic majority, right? It's very much set up in a way to preserve the power of the relatively small group of property owners, the small group of the wealthy that exist. Anyway, let's start to get into this a little bit more now. So how do we understand the relationship even between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Again, sort of the conventional knowledge or the conventional wisdom is that there's kind of a straight line from one to the other, that they sort of logically imply one another, or that the Constitution is sort of like the logical culmination of the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. However, another view sees these things as sort of in conflict with each other, that the Declaration actually represented a much more kind of radical political philosophy, much more radical ideas. The idea of consent of the governed, and that the government's there to, you know, preserve justice among the people, which of course implies a sense of equality among people. Whereas the Constitution is kind of a conservative reaction to those radical ideas. It's kind of tampering down, toning down, watering down those radical ideas, which is an interesting idea. Of course, in between the two, you also have the Articles of Confederation, which is sort of the first sort of failed attempt at creating a constitution. We don't have to concern ourselves too much with that. That's more historical trivia at this point. It did create a fairly weak system of government under the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution was, at the very least, an attempt at creating a stronger government. But by creating a stronger government, also, again, sort of, you know, preserving and sort of consolidating, you know, the power of the property owning classes in North and South. Now, again, most of the founders, including Jefferson, were influenced by the ideas of John Locke and Montesquieu, especially Locke. In Locke's second treatise of government, Locke was an English political philosopher from about a century before the Declaration. He defines natural rights as life, liberty, and property, which should sound familiar to people. Why does Jefferson then change it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, could it be that most people in society did not actually own property? But that kind of gives you a clue of what these ideas were really about, right? They were, again, the sort of the ideology, basically, of the property owning classes. They wanted a system of government that was going to protect their property, that was going to, you know, prevent the government from infringing on their property. So you can't have, like, you know, poor people voting in a government that's going to, you know, take their money away through, or property away through taxes and things like that. You don't want a government that's going to spend too much money on social welfare and things like that. They wanted a government that had very minimal powers in most regards, at least, and a government that would more or less guarantee their right to own property and to protect the property that they already owned. Anyway, if you read the famous passage here from the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So even though it has that very sort of conservative framing of life, liberty, and property, which he changes to the pursuit of happiness, maybe to make it a little more democratic sounding, the second part of it, though, is kind of a radical idea. He's saying, look, if the government doesn't protect your rights, if the government doesn't do what it's supposed to, then you have the right to change that government, to alter or to abolish it. So he's saying you can alter it, you can change it, but if you can't do that, if the structure is rigid and hard and the ruling class of society is not willing to change, then you can abolish it. And that is, of course, a very radical idea to affect their safety and happiness, as it says. So we all know that, despite the lofty ideas of all men are created equal, which again is another very radical idea, coming from a world where social inequalities were taken for granted among people based on birth, asserting a belief that all men are created equal. It does use men, not people. We'll address that again when we get to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The reality of life in the new American Republic, of course, fell very short of these ideas. Women were considered citizens, but not allowed to vote. African Americans, both slaves and free men, right? Not every black person in America was a slave, even back then. Doesn't matter, though, weren't allowed to vote. And Native Americans were not allowed to vote either. So we know they very much fell short of those ideas. Now, here's where we get into Charles Beard's work on the Constitution, a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. Beard argues that the Constitution, again, was primarily motivated by the financial interest of the founders. So there's a kind of class conflict ingrained in this. Of course, that's a very important idea within Marx as well, right? Marx understands that, again, history is sort of, moved forward by material forces or by economic forces. Marx understood that class struggle or class conflict was the motivating force within history as well, that the organization of economic forces basically leads to class conflict. And then again, and what I spent a lot of time talking about, because I think it's probably the most complicated idea, trying to understand then the labor theory of value. Those are kind of the most important aspects of Marx's theory. The idea of historical materialism, the idea of class struggle or class conflict, and the labor theory of value. Anyway, so Beard, who's writing this in the early 20th century, in 1913, we talked, so here we are, this is the third class now, and we're still talking about this period of time. I've talked a lot about, the double standard in American politics around the time of the First World War as a historical example. We talked about, the Randolph Bourne essay last class. Here you have another book. We talked about Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, which also kind of comes from this period of time, from a book written in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folk. So a little bit before that, but still generally within that period of time. Now we're talking about another book from this era by Charles Beard, where he's arguing that the founders were mostly motivated by their financial interests or by their economic interests, not by these sort of abstract concepts of liberty and equality and all these highfalutin ideas like that. No, they had very sort of practical concerns in mind. They wanted to, again, make sure that their property was going to be secure. They're the wealthy classes within society. I say classes because you could sort of split them up between a sort of merchant class in the North and a slave-owning plantation class in the South. That northern merchant class would eventually sort of morph into an industrial class. But these classes, whatever other differences they had, they wanted to make sure that their property was going to be secure. And so they created the Constitution, basically to guarantee that. And it worked pretty well. George Washington was the wealthiest man in America. Not a lot of people know that. He was a large landowner who had many financial interests as well. In other words, he would loan out, he kind of act like a bank. He had a lot of money, so he'd loan out money and, charge people interest on it. Hamilton, Washington's secretary of Treasury, the first Secretary of the Treasury, did a lot to help financial speculators in his day, around Wall Street. So you can see that's nothing new. Who one of the big scams that he pulled off was the giving them sort of inside information about war bonds. So what that was that during the Revolutionary War, the government, to raise money, sold bonds. That's what governments do. That's what companies do when they need to raise money. They sell bonds. It's like basically a form of debt. You buy the bond. So in short term, you give the government money by buying the bond. In exchange for that, you then cash the bond in at a later date and make interest on it. So a lot of people, a lot of farmers, a lot of lower income people did that to support the revolution. In the meantime, we're talking a little over 10 years here from the beginning of the American Revolution, almost 15 years, in fact. Those bonds had basically become worthless. They weren't able really to do anything with it. The government on the Articles of Confederation was having a very hard time paying off these bonds. So people just had these things, but they thought that they were basically worthless. Hamilton, however, tipped off his buddies on Wall Street and said, look, we have this new Constitution coming through. When the Constitution comes out, we're going to include within the Constitution, and it is included within the Constitution, Article 6, that the debts of the government are going to be fully paid. So we're going to pay off all those war bonds at full value. So this tipped these guys off. What they did is that they went around, bought up all these bonds, for pennies on the dollar, as they would say. In other words, not paying the full value of the bonds, but telling these farmers and soldiers and small businessmen and people like that, they're like, look, you have these bonds, they're not worth anything. I'll buy it from you. I'm not going to pay the full value of it, but you'll get something out of it. And of course, these people who had these things thought they were worthless, but like, all right, well, it's better than nothing. So what these financial people did is they bought the bonds for very cheap. Then when the Constitution came into play, they cashed them in and got the full value plus interest on the bonds. So this kind of financial chicanery and trickery has gone on in this country since the very beginning, which should not be surprising. Another thing that was going on is that there was actual class conflict going on. There was a significant amount of economic conflict between upper and lower classes going on. One of the things that had happened preceding the Constitution was an event known as Shays' Rebellion, and around Daniel Shays. And what this was a rebellion by former Revolutionary War veterans in Massachusetts who were pissed off. These are people that had, risked their lives fighting the British against the war. They thought things were going to get better. Things were not getting better. Things were basically, as bad, if not worse, after the revolution. And they were fed up, and they were taking arms. They were, refusing to pay their taxes. They were, assaulting tax collectors and things like that, burning down buildings. I mean, real, class conflict kind of stuff. It was this event that actually preceded, or actually, again, facilitated the Constitutional Convention, which eventually led to the drafting of the Constitution that we know as now. Originally, it was presented as they were going to try to alter, they were going to try to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up just completely scrapping it and coming up with a brand new document. But this again was another sort of motivating force. They need to, so they want a government. So try to understand what they're doing here. They want a government that on the one hand is going to preserve their property. They want a government that's going to be so intrusive, that's going to redistribute wealth, God forbid, or do anything like that. On the other hand, they want a government that at least has enough force that it can put down people like this, which it did do by force, even preceding the Constitution, but they basically had to call out the militia basically to do so. One of the people who sort of preceded or presided over the efforts to suppress Shays' rebellion was Henry Knox, who also served on Washington's cabinet. He became the first Secretary of War, which is now known as the Secretary of Defense. Interesting change of phrasing there, but we won't go into that. Anyway, Knox writes in a letter to Washington, he says their creed, meaning the Shays people, their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from confiscation of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. Now, what does that entail, right? When you're talking about common property, common ownership of the wealth of the country. And he that attempts opposition to this creed is an enemy to equity and justice and ought to be swept from off the face of the earth. So these were serious antagonisms that were going on, leading up to the founding of the Constitution. So how democratic is the Constitution? Again, as I've said, we supposedly live in a democratic republic, although people like Sheldon Wolin and various other people would disagree with that view. But even people who are more, conventional defenders of the American system have to admit that the Constitution is not a particularly democratic constitution, at least not in its original form. It's become maybe a little more democratic through various amendments and, even other things that may not directly impact upon the Constitution. But certainly in its original form, and certainly to a large extent still to this very day, it's not a particularly democratic political system. It is a political system, again, that is designed to give an advantage to the wealthy elites, who make up a minority within the society. So it's trying to take power away from the majority of people in order to preserve the minority. But minority, we're not talking about racial minorities or ethnic minorities in this sense. We're talking about, an economic minority, the wealthy, in other words. So the Constitution contains several institutions that severely limit or undermine the force of popular majorities. This helped consolidate the power of the property-owning classes, both in the North and South. Of course, in the original version, you have the 3/5 compromise, which I think everyone knows, but most people have heard of, but if you haven't, that was a compromise over how to count slaves within the population of the United States. And the reason why this was a significant thing is that at least in the House of Representatives, as well as in the Electoral College, the greater the population of the state, the more representatives that you have, the more electoral votes that you have in the Electoral College. Of course, I'll talk about those things more in a moment. Northerners didn't want slaves counted at all, which at least makes sense in the fact that, if these people are not going to have any political power, if they're not going to have any say in the representation of the government, that at least is logically consistent. The Southerners, of course, wanted their slaves to be counted within the population total, which would have given them more political power. Now, you have to understand the sinister logic of using the bodies of slaves to give them more political power, to then use that political power to further consolidate the power of slavery. That's how sort of twisted these people were. Another thing to keep in mind, and obviously that's beyond undemocratic. Another thing to keep in mind is that originally there were property restrictions on the right to vote, although these were mostly held by states. They were not necessarily in the Constitution itself. But originally, I already mentioned women, Blacks, Native Americans could not vote within the United States. But originally, even if you were white, you had to own a certain amount of property to even be allowed to vote. So even more undemocratic back then. Anyway, Beard writes about this. He says in chapter 2 of his book, which you can find the whole text online. I think the version I read didn't have the pagination to it, so I just wrote chapter 2. But the Southern planter was also as much concerned in maintaining order against slave revolts as the creditor in Massachusetts was concerned in putting down Shays' desperate debtors. They were the Shays people were highly indebted. Their economic living was not good. They weren't making enough money to pay their debts, or they were taking on debts because they couldn't afford to procure the means of life with whatever income they were getting. And the possibilities of such servile insurrections were by no means remote. Every slave owner must have felt more secure in 1789 when he knew that the governor of his state could call in the strong arm of the federal administration in case a domestic disturbance got beyond the local police and militia. The North might make discriminatory commercial regulation, but they could be regarded as a sort of insurance against conflagrations that might bring ruin in their train. It was obviously better to ship products under adverse legislation than to have no products to ship. So again, talking about the sort of class alliance between northern and southern ruling classes in their efforts to get the Constitution ratified. And again, you know, we are used to talking about the Constitution in very hallowed, sacred terms. Not everybody thought that way about it. The famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement with hell, during a public ceremony where he burned a copy of the Constitution. Imagine somebody doing that now. So people realized how undemocratic it was, and really going even beyond that, that it was a system of government set up to protect slavery. Whether or not the Northerners approved of slavery, the Northern ruling class approved of slavery, they were at least willing to tolerate it and allow it to exist and even to expand, as long as it would sort of would make an agreement with the Southern ruling class to protect their property as well. Now, of course, Beard's view of history, or was sometimes referred to as historiography, his sort of understanding of historical writings, which, you know, I mean, he's writing in a way that is critical of the established historical narrative of the Constitution. Later historians, of course, took issue with his interpretation of things, especially the sort of Cold War historians. So you have this historian writing, making class conflict an explicit part of understanding the Constitution, his sort of historical interpretation of the Constitution. Now you have the Cold War. The United States is in this conflict with the Soviet Union. Do you really want the dominant interpretation of history in the United States to stress class conflict? That sounds like commie shit. You can't have that. So that view of history kind of fell out of favor. And you had another school of history known as the consensus school, which we'll talk more about at a later point. But basically, their view was that the consensus school was that the founders were not motivated by their economic interests. They were motivated by their deep-seated belief in liberty and equality for every person. And there was kind of an agreement too. The reason why it's called the consensus school is because there's an agreement among elites within the United States, even among different political parties, about liberty and equality and sacred property rights and the right of contracts and all that other stuff. They all sort of agreed on those things. And to a certain extent, they did agree on those things, especially property rights and things like that. To what extent were they really motivated by their belief in liberty and equality? I'm sure to some extent they were. But to ignore their deep-seated economic interests, I think, is a bit absurd. And I would also say that I believe in more recent years, Beard's version of things has sort of come back into fashion, if I can use that term. You know, people are now realizing, no, this actually makes a lot more sense than just believing that they all just, you know, were motivated by these sort of abstract principles. So that is kind of the long preamble to talking about, you know, some important stuff leading up to the Constitution. I think we're just getting now into talking about the different articles of the Constitution and the system of government that they set out. I think I will save that for last class because I realize, you know, once again, I've been talking for a while. So what I'll do is I'll sort of break this up into a two-part class. So the next class, I will continue with this. I'll also then, as it says on the syllabus, also address the other article, the New York Times article, Another Stab at the Constitution, which includes ways to sort of fix or improve or you know, supposedly improve on the Constitution. So I think I can go back and forth and refer to that as I'm going through the Constitution here, as well as the Federalist Papers, which I've not talked about yet. Okay, so that'll be all for now. So take care of it.